Review development programs and projects. The programs and projects reaching the indigenous peoples of the Philippines are made possible through the support of international agencies, the government, NGOs, and IPOs. Presented here are the sample of this venture and suggestion for ADB to consider. The International Labour Organization, or ILO, serves as the only international agency that has adopted the specific standards covering indigenous peoples. To address the issue, ILO has taken a twofold approach of promoting its Convention 169 at the government level and providing technical assistance on indigenous peoples' issues. ILO's current development program for indigenous people is interregional program to support self-reliance of indigenous people and tribal communities through cooperatives and other self-help organizations, or INDISCO, which uses approach-driven participatory approach rather than a top-down approach. The latter was found ineffective since it makes indigenous peoples dependent and is considered a disservice to their communities, which were traditionally self-reliant. INDISCO's current projects are classified into four components: preservation and promotion of the indigenous culture, promotion of decent employment and income opportunities, promotion of gender equality and environment and natural resources, protection and rehabilitation. There are 4 indigenous communities involved in these projects in Mindanao, 2 in Occidental Mindoro, 2 in Cordillera, and 1 in Zambales.
Sobrang hirap talaga. Andun yung discrimination, may crisis, walang trabaho, tapos yung hanap buhay, pangabuhayan, medyo limited lang.
Hindi masyadong angat yung pamumuhay doon sa amin. Pag IP ka, wala yan. Wala yung kakayahang umangat sa buhay.
Hindi pa sila masyadong aware kung ano ba ang kanilang basic rights, particularly on ancestral domain. Pero pagpasok ng ILO, doon na nila nalaman kung ano ang kanilang karapatan, gagampanan doon sa kanilang sariling territory.
Drawing inspiration substantially from ILO Convention 169, the Philippine government enacted a landmark legislation called the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act. IPRA is consistent with the principles of the ILO Convention 169, which serves as the only legally binding instrument that recognizes the IP's rights covering a wide range of issues.
The United Nations Development Program and the 4 main environmental problems. The global warming. Let us talk about global warming. It is the unusual rapid increase in Earth's average temperature. Pollution of international waters. Because of the man-made waste, the waters become polluted. Destruction of biological diversity. Destruction is a major cause of biodiversity. Loss is caused by deforestation, overpopulation, pollution, and the global warming. The depletion of stratospheric ozone layer. When chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, and halon gas are formerly found in aerosol spray and refrigerants are released into atmosphere. United Nations Development Program. The Global Environment Facility, or GEF, established in 1990, is co-managed by the World Bank, UNDP, and the United Nations Environment Program. It is designed to assist developing countries to deal with environmental problems. In the Philippines, the objectives of the GEF SGP sponsored sub-projects are the following: promotion of biodiversity conservation in selected priority biogeographic regions, selected for protection of international waters from environmental impact of activities from within territorial boundaries of the Philippines, reduction of greenhouse gas emissions to the promotion of renewable energy in rural areas. Since 1994, the GEF SGP has approved 21 projects that involves NGOs and indigenous peoples. 16 focus on biodiversity conservation, 4 on climate change, and 1 on depletion of ozone layer. In terms of location, 12 are in Luzon, 3 in Visayas, and 6 in Mindanao. United Nations Development Program. To summarize my report, the main objectives of UNDP is to assist the developing countries in their strategy to continue improvement of their life and to focus on indigenous peoples to help them to enhance their skills and knowledge about life, culture, and also to protect natural resources and the environmental. Moreover, to maintain the culture and traditions, UNDP supports different projects in different countries until now. The Philippine-Australia Community Assistance Program or PACAP is one component of Australia's Development Cooperation Program. It supports community initiative, economically sustainable, ecological, sound and gender responsive development efforts. PACAP started in the Philippines in 1986 and to date, it has supported 932 projects, 95 projects involved indigenous peoples, and 7 ongoing on 2001. These are all on cultural development, including crop production, post-harvest, facilities and marketing, and management of the environmental natural resources on the sustained basis. 6 of the projects are in Mindanao, 1 in Baguio City. Projects implemented in areas with indigenous peoples deal with women's health, education, rural finance, agrarian reform, water development, and the local government units. Social expenditure and the transmission of grid. Those with direct reference to indigenous peoples are the following: early childhood development, community-based resource management, SOPAD, social fund, conservation of priority protected projects, rural roads and development projects, national roads improvement and management project, Subic Bay Freeport Development 2. In 2002, the World Bank provided a grant to NEDA to undertake a project capacity building for social environmental assessment. PACAP with the partnership of NGOs and people's organization with the objectives of lifting the living standard of for marginalized peoples with the help of projects and the program of stimulate women's health, education, and livelihoods at the indigenous people. It also promotes peace and unity, no matter how huge the differences of culture and traditions. Also, the World Bank provide a subsidy to government to create more projects to improve the quality of life of the indigenous peoples and to create more programs and with the next generation of these people.
The World Bank launched a guide called Operational Directive 420 for Indigenous People last September 1991. This directive is made to ensure that indigenous people benefit from the project and not depriving of their rights. Philippines is said to use the guidelines and reference addressing to issues concerning their IPS.
The recent draft of 2001 to 2004 Medium-Term Philippine Development Plan considers poverty reduction as its objective. According to Secretary Deles, there is a chapter on Mindanao where most of the indigenous people live. The main strategies for economic development and social reconstruction hold the promise of changes in the lives of indigenous people if they are pursued with a strong political will by the government. The strategies are as follows: relief and rehabilitation in conflict-affected areas. This will entail relocation and resettlement of families. It means that, for example, in the past years, the battle, the battle in Marawi, the citizens are forced to evacuate and relocate homes due to the damages in the city that the war had given them. Or another example, when a typhoon strikes. Recently, around 2 to 4 weeks ago, three typhoons hit the Philippines, which are Typhoon Shawnee, Typhoon Rolly, and Typhoon Ulysses. And the citizens of those affected by the flood are evacuated to a higher ground. Provision of basic services, livelihood opportunities, and other needs that would ensure minimum desirable levels of welfare, that even psychosocial needs are considered. It is a responsibility of the higher ups or the government to provide these physical needs to those who need or require it. Psychosocial needs are to be given to those who are experiencing a mental problem, a mental disorder, emotional problem such as that, or spiritual problems. Implementation of culturally sensitive programs. So what it means is that the program or project to be held in an indigenous community adjusts to their cultural norms and practices of that certain community, such as healthcare entailing intersectoral collaborations to make it sensitive and conform to their cultural norms and practices. Education for Muslims and indigenous peoples are to be revised to make them more relevant to their culture or religion. Next is the implementation of the RA 8371 or the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act. They focus on the return of ancestral lands of indigenous peoples for their utilization and use. As said in the law, all lands given by ancestors or those who owned it must be passed down to those younger members of the family. Next is peace talks with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front or the MILF. It is the reason for this is to cease the gunfire or the war conflict, whatever it is, with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front or the Moro National Liberation Front towards the lands of Mindanao and government. And then lastly, the peace, education, and advocacy. It is to teach children and people to resolve conflicts without any violence needed or conducted.
Good afternoon. The Department of Health issued Departmental Policy Number 142, mandating provisions of resources for indigenous peoples concerned. DOH has created a National Technical Working Group for Indigenous Health Development Program. Poor nutrition is one of the health issues that most affects indigenous peoples. In addition to circumstances of extreme poverty, indigenous peoples suffer from malnutrition because of environmental degradation and contamination of the ecosystems in which indigenous communities have traditionally lived. Loss of land and territory, and a decline in abundance of accessibility of traditional food sources. Another initiative is the creation of Indigenous Peoples Health Development Project and partnership including the provision of grants for capacity building and community project for local NGOs and people organization in partnership with Indigenous peoples community. Healthcare must take into account the indigenous concept of health and preserve and strengthen indigenous health systems as a strategy to increase access and coverage of healthcare. The project includes water system development, nutrition, community development training, environmental health sanitation, and control of local endemic diseases. The partnership program is currently working with the Dumagat in General Nakar, Kongking in Ormoc City, Bihog in Camarines Norte, and Agta in Central Luzon. DOH trained volunteer and health workers from the communities with emphasis on their roles as community mobilizers, health service providers, and health learning facilitators. The advocacy and promotion of effective health strategies that directly benefit indigenous people and strategic health planning workshop for indigenous peoples. The proposed activities in 2000 to 2001 includes The assessment to identify priority areas for assistance. It is to locate areas where most indigenous people needs proper assistance. The construction of 8 village health structure in the 7 provinces or cities of Region 11. The capacity building of service providers in selected 8 indigenous peoples area in Mindanao. And the development of 12 water sources in indigenous peoples including Cordillera region, in which water is a conflict of resources for irrigation. Again, good afternoon. This is Catherine Joy Fabro.
Poverty is one of the perennial problems that all administration in the Philippines had to deal with. The Department of Social Welfare and Development is implementing the comprehensive and integrated delivery of social services. One of the flagship programs of the Social Reform and Poverty Alleviation Act, RA 8425. What is RA 8425 all about? An act institutionalizing the social reform and poverty alleviation program, creating for a purpose the National Anti-Poverty Commission, defining its powers and function, and for other purposes. The law also identified the basic sectors that are the targets of the government's poverty alleviation drive, and these are the farmers, peasants, artisanal fisher folks, workers in the formal sectors, migrant workers, workers in the informal sector, indigenous peoples, cultural communities, women, differently abled persons, senior citizens, victims of calamities and disasters, youths, students, children, and urban poor. What is the main goal of program? Its goal is the empowerment of disadvantaged families, communities, and sectors so that they can access basic services and manage their resources. Where did the fund came from? One of its funding sources is the Australia-funded Vulnerable Group Facility. SEEDS, or the Comprehensive and Integrated Delivery of Social Services, is being implemented in 1,084 municipalities, 3,793 villages, and 100 poor communities. The program helped to liberate the indigenous peoples from indignity. It seeks to extend culturally appropriate projects to indigenous peoples' communities to ensure their survival, build their capabilities in managing community-based service, preserve their ancestral domain, and also to develop their cultural heritage through the help of the government, non-government, and other sectoral resources. The objective of the program are to establish an ethnographic profile, strengthen indigenous values, knowledge systems, and practices through rediscovery and reorientation sessions and need assessment tools, provide basic services to the communities, and modify, develop, and institutionalize culturally appropriate projects and programs for families and individuals, sectors in need of special protection.
The Department of Environment and Natural Resources, or the DENR, commenced varying activities that secure indigenous peoples here in the Philippines since 2001. Indigenous peoples are one of the biggest concerns that our government should hear out, wherein actions are urgent and serves as the reason why the DNR established these projects to equip indigenous peoples. Community-Based Forestry Management Program, or the CBFM, and the Management of Ancestral Domain Claims are the regular activities executed by the DNR that aims to sustain the forest resources and equally distribute the access for the benefit of it, and to have indigenous peoples claim of ownership to the whole environment that they occupied and use. This follows the forest and watershed management to provide goods and services without harming the water resources, biodiversity management and conservation projects, not only to address indigenous people's concern over water, degraded source of water, insufficient funding and infrastructure, but also to conserve the biodiversity and maintain the ecosystem of our country that are beneficial in a way that it produces our goods and services. To address upland socio-economic development is also one of the goals by the DENR. The activities under this are improving the agricultural technology, have an easy access to basic services and markets, and strengthening the existing community organizations. It is anticipated that these projects will be carried out orderly and systematic to empower Indigenous peoples. I am Rania Grace Flores. The Department of Education, Culture, and Sports made its way to aid Indigenous peoples here in the Philippines through launching different projects. One of these projects is the Basic Education Assistance for Mindanao that covers the regions 11, 12, and Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao or the ARMM. It aims to expand educational opportunities for the poor and disadvantaged population groups, promote curriculum flexibility and localization, and strengthen partnerships in education. This program will run from 2002 to 2008 and it is said to have a budget of 39.2 million Australian dollar or 1,378,562,488 pesos. It will be completed by establishing 80 community multi-purpose and learning centers in remote communities, providing scholarships for selected poor Muslim and Indigenous peoples high school graduates to complete teacher education courses, and setting up cultural enhancement facilities in 18 strategically located schools. The Department of Education, Culture, and Sports gave their words to be more responsive to Indigenous people's concerns, to have elementary and secondary curricula, and to develop an unbiased, non-formal educational system which is beneficial to Indigenous peoples in preserving their cultural heritage.
October 10, 2001, government approved the Republic of the Philippine Asian Development Bank Poverty Partnership Agreement that aims to provide adequate protection for the poor, vulnerable, and disadvantaged sectors. The preliminary listing of relevant NGOs and IPOs were generated from the 7 ethnographic area consultation by the Office of Presidential Advisor on Indigenous Peoples Affairs. This project is not just dealing with poverty but also in delineation and recovery of ancestral land, health, education, livelihood, and technology transfer. The activities and expected outputs points to the concept of participation and empowerment and improved quality life of living among 3 marginalized sectors. NGOs and IPOs may operate at a national level, but would have a specific continuity priority locations and field of expertise for project implementation purposes. On the other hand, NGOs and IPOs may not always explicitly refer to the term poverty reduction as their goal or objective. Asian Development Bank also indicates the necessity of setting up community and home-based social services interventions using local government units, non-government organizations, indigenous peoples organizations, and cooperatives as delivery mechanisms. Moreover, national commissions on indigenous peoples expanding its inventory of such organizations for purposes of networking, depending on their geographic locations, priority projects, and skills. ADB may address all poverty-related issues, and if effectively implemented, should result in a better quality life of indigenous peoples. I am Alaysa Migalieta reporting.
And other particular private sectors such as Mangyan Missions and Green Forum that continuously help indigenous people. This is Janica Garcia reporting.
Priority Trust, Ancestral Land and Domain. Anthrowatch, organized in 1994, is a building equipment for mapping and delineation of works with POPID in Romblon, Panay, and parts of Mindanao. It also conducts community organization, capacity building, cultural sensitivity training, research on health situation among indigenous peoples with coordination of DOH. Panilipi and the Legal Resource Center handle the legal aspect of land issues, formulation of ancestral domain management, plan and ancestral sustainable plans, protection plan, involve NGOs such as Sentro ng Ganap Pampamayanan, Indaundayang Panghanghab Tao or UGAT, or Anthropological Association of the Philippines, the Pambansang Lupon ng mga nakakatanda sa tribo, ANIPO, Program of Action for Third Organization in Central Luzon, Northern Luzon, Mindoro, Palawan, and Mindanao. Another IPO Tribal Education for Ecological System, Incorporation in Compostela Valley, Mindanao, assist in self-delineation.
Go.
Katutubong Samahan ng Pilipinas, Panagtagpo, Lumad Development Center, conduct most of the organizing and group work before mapping activities begin. The Anthro Watch, or Anthropology Watch, was founded by the group of anthropology graduate students of University of the Philippines, Diliman, in 1993, which the purpose of perceive the gap between the academic focus of education and the practice of development. Panilipi and the Legal Resource Center handle the legal aspect of land issues. Also, the different organization of the indigenous peoples that are mentioned. Thank you.
The one central domain is the main problem of IPs. Some NGO and IPO are claim of some as central land as their area and usually monitor activity and prohibit outsiders to do land mapping. Despite of that, the National Commission of Indigenous People, NCIP, together with the National Information Authority of NAMRIA, Housing and Land Use Regulatory Board, HLURB, Department of Agrarian Reform or DAR, conducted land mapping as recognized the land that entitled of the IPs, manual opinions between civil society is to said advance IPO goal.
Lesson learned? Based on the experience of the NGOs and IPOs in ancestral land and domain issues, the following aspects merit attention. Professionalize. Once a decision has been reached by a non-government official, organization, to undertake mapping and delineation, a unit should be set up. The staff should be trained and they should focus their work on the task at hand. Expertise is built up in this manner. A combination of experience and training among NGOs, IPOs, government organizations, and communities further hones the skills of staff. Network. There's a wealth of knowledge in the various local and international agencies. Thus, formal linkages should be developed with these groups. PAFID's first attempt at on-ground mapping of 3,980 hectares in Mindoro took 3 years, which is 1989 to 1992. A series of linkages accelerated their pace and expanded the extent of their coverage. In 1993, the Ford Foundation introduced the group to the expertise of Dr. Uraivan in Thailand. The World Wildlife Biodiversity Program provided a geographic positioning system, and the Foundation on the Philippine Environment facilitated training on its use.
3 trainers sent by the Washington-based manufacturer co-developed a curriculum with Philippine Association for Intercultural Development. Clark University in the US involved PAFID in developing its data management software for NGOs in a joining project among 11 partners globally. The General Assembly proclaimed the International Decade of the World's Indigenous People. The goal was to strengthen international cooperation for the solution of problems faced by the indigenous peoples, such as human rights, including some areas in environment, development, education, and health. In 1995, during an international training event, the concept of ancestral waters was shared by the Mesquite Indians of Panama, an indigenous ethnic group in Central America, and is successfully implemented by the Tagbanwa of Palawan. On this year, an open-ended intersessional working group to express concern with regard to some of the core provisions of the draft declaration, including the right to self-determination of indigenous peoples and control over natural resources existing on indigenous peoples. The visitation and communication by individuals and organizations serve as continuing learning process. The U.S. Peace Corps conducted extensive documentation of the Mindoro experience. An Australian volunteer brought in her knowledge of geodetics. Another volunteer, a U.S. trainee with expertise in remote sensing, wrote a manual with PAFID. The first one is invest. In investing, equipment should be bought and upgraded as necessary. It is to secure significant growth. Its use should be optimized and the system analyzed such that repairs can be performed by staff. Right funding is vital. There should be continuous links with expert and upgrade skills, which produces positive impact on productivity. The other written manual will be reported to you by Ms. Maria Monica Flora. This is Catherine Joy Fabro reporting.
Train. The Philippine Association for Intercultural Development has trained 127 indigenous people on the whole process of delineation from the initial survey to validation. The purpose of this is to achieve sufficient expertise to conduct training in other countries. In fact, Juan Dulangan Manovo from Sultan Kudarat has achieved expertise and conduct training in other countries. Trust and respect. Trust and respect requires every team member to take responsibility for their action. There is sharing of tasks in community preparation and in mapping activities. The indigenous peoples take care of securing the team and the instruments, handling and safekeeping of hardware. It is important that NGOs listen to the community and explain clearly the concept and tasks for completion of delineation activities. The activity is not just mapping, but it is also making statements regarding indigenous people's lives.
A workshop should be conducted to the different organizations and agencies to acknowledge their efforts and knowledge. Based on the ASEAN Development Bank or the ADB, there have these negative issues that stir up on some agencies. They were informed that non-government organizations have equipment that their staff are unable to use, that some hardware is not working, and demand to tap the existing resources such as the Environmental Science for Social Change Incorporation, the GEOPLAN, or known as the Department of Science and Technology funded by the NGO, Dumangan Missions, and the Geographic Information Systems Laboratory of the University of San Carlos in Cebu City. However, it is said that the key to oversee these issues is to conduct a workshop wherein the outcome will be the setting up of Resource Management Institute in which all endeavors could be coordinated, integrated, and housed, basic training for the NGOs and indigenous peoples organization and other parties could be conducted, and networking skills and hardware development can continue. I am Rania Gracie Flores. Back to you, Miss Michelle.
They say education is the most powerful weapon which we can use to change the world. Meanwhile, the privilege of education to indigenous students before was being sadly disregarded. Now, many sectors are working compassionately to give efforts for the curriculum to reach them out. The celebration of IP communities is they are now more being prioritized. In fact, the Kalahan Foundation in Santa Fe, Mugan has been conducting education sessions with the Kalahan and Mangyan people under the advocacy of NGOs such as the Asian Council for People's Culture. This is Janica Garcia reporting.